This panel that we have here is how to cut carbon and how fast can we go. Our panel is David Wright, Director of Electricity Transmission and Chief Engineer of Electricity at the National Grid. Polly Billington is Director of UK 100. Tim Lord is Director of Clean Growth at BEIS. And David Joffe is Economy-Wide Analysis Lead at the Committee on Climate Change. This is your first panel of the morning. Please give them a welcome. So, how to cut carbon and how fast can we go? David Wright.
Well, good morning, everybody, and I'm delighted to be here. Just building on a couple of Andrew's facts, I think there's a lot we can be proud of, actually, here in the UK, in the progress that's really been made in how we have cut carbon. 67% of those carbon reductions that Andrew spoke about have happened in the power sector. And it was only a few years ago, I remember attending events like this, and the conversation in the room was, we're never going to get to our 2020 target levels, and we've got there a couple of years early. And that's happened through, clear, stable policy that has enabled, contracts for differences and other renewable generations to go forward. And at the UK at the moment, we're leading the offshore wind industry around the world. And there's a production line of a couple of gigawatts of offshore wind getting connected to the system every year moving forward. We've built a number of new interconnectors and a number of others in the pipeline. But not everything is rosy, and we've certainly seen the nuclear industry cannot get commercial funding to get that away as a source of low-carbon generation at the moment. But there's a lot we can be proud of. I think we're currently decarbonising the UK faster than any of the other G20 countries. So, but then we look to the future, and what I and a number of my colleagues at National Grid spend a lot of time thinking about is, we need to recognise the changes that are going on in the world and in people's lives. And people, deserve to have clean air to breathe. And we deserve to find a way of doing the energy transitions which is going to impact on everybody's lives, not only in where energy is sourced from today, but how our homes are heated and how we transport and the cars we buy, if you will. So it's going to impact on everybody. And we need to bring all of those communities together and find a way of doing that fairly. So it's not just the prosperous end of society that is benefiting. So that's what we're focusing on. We really welcome David's CCC report on net zero. We believe this is an ambition that the country needs to progress, and we can get there. But to get there, it needs that stable policy environment, good regulation, and some strong decision making. We also think that there's real diversity in what needs to be done. In actual fact, getting to net zero makes the policy framework, I think, a lot simpler, because a lot of things need to get progressed, and if you truly believe it, a number of that become low regrets decision making. So we absolutely should be embracing all of the local community-based generation. There was 275 energy companies in 2011 in the UK. Last time I checked, that number's over 3,200. But we also need to be finding ways to deliver the transition at the least cost for the country. And that does mean, doing anticipatory investment where it's appropriate to do it, so that that infrastructure is built out to enable that energy climate to happen.
Can you devolve the supply of electricity and at the same time keep the price down? Or doesn't that automatically make it more expensive?
So I think this comes down to a sort of question about technology and innovation. I think if you get it right, we've seen huge changes in the cost of solar, driven by the investment in the Chinese. Battery costs are absolutely tumbling. Offshore wind was £130 a megawatt a few years ago. The last CFD auction, I think, was 57. So I think with the right investment and timing the investment with a strong policy environment. I think there are ways through that.
It will be a challenge, I would think.
It will be a challenge, and what David's report identifies is there's a significant amount of investment needed in energy infrastructure here in the UK to achieve the net zeros, and we shouldn't shy away from that. But I think the costs are constantly moving.
David, the other David, the official target is still to get net emissions down by 80%, but your latest report advocated we go to net zero emissions. What extra has to be done? Never mind getting to the 80%. What extra has to be done to get to net zero?
Well, the 80% reduction allowed some remaining emissions in some sectors. Now, that could be heating, for example, or in transport. There are various different ways you can cut it, and that was actually part of the problem with the 80% target, is that you look at that and you think, well, I want to be in the 20%. Net zero means going as far as we can on everything, and still we will have some remaining emissions.
And so in simple terms, just to clarify, that means that to get to net zero, we stop heating with gas and we stop cooking with gas.
With natural gas, yes.
Yes.
But we can switch to hydrogen, for example, so that will be one of the options. So that will be a
Which
low
is still
carbon
very
gas.
expensive.
It is more
alternative.
expensive, yes.
Very expensive.
Well, at the moment, we're not doing it at the scale that we would require, and if you do it at the scale that we would require, then it will be less costly than it is today. But yes, it's more expensive.
Has the government given you any indication yet as to whether it's going to accept the tougher target?
We've had no formal indication about whether it's going to happen. All we know is what we read in the newspapers.
Probably because their minds are elsewhere. Just to clarify on this, the big change then in decarbonising to get to net zero brings the issue right into the household.
It does, absolutely, yes.
Has anybody told the public this yet?
I think that this is one of the big challenges that we have. The public seem to be very engaged in terms of needing action on climate change, in terms of being willing to set a very ambitious target, but when it comes to the actions that will be required to meet it, I think the public are quite a way behind where they need to be. For example, moving away from natural gas in the home, whether that's to heat pumps, whether it's to hydrogen. Most people don't know even that they're going to have to move away from natural gas, let alone what the solutions are. And, you know, whether it's hydrogen, whether it's heat pumps, it will be more expensive than what we do today because natural gas is cheap and plentiful. So there are big decisions for government to make in the 2020s, and that's difficult if you don't engage with the public because there's every chance you'll make the wrong decision and people won't like it and it will be more expensive.
You get
and
a
so
backlash
on.
as
And
well.
you don't want the backlash, so you need to engage with people before that, and we have a very limited window to do that because the decisions need to be made in the next 5 years or so, and that, yeah, that's a big challenge for government.
Polly, as we gather here this morning, gas, a fossil fuel, is providing 60% of our electricity generation. Wind is providing 4%. Even the French are providing us with more electricity than wind this morning. That's just a snapshot, and there are other times.
Yeah.
Last night, for example, wind was almost 25%, though in a sense that also emphasizes the swings that wind in itself can make. But as we sit this morning and see 60 versus 4, there are other renewables too, but not many. These are national grid figures. They don't include some local generation. We would seem to have a long way to go even to get to the 80% target, never mind the net zero target.
Well, I think it's worth reminding ourselves that we've also had a fortnight without any electricity generated by coal, which is the first time we've had that since the 1880s. And when we talk about those fluctuations, the kind of power system we're going to have in the future is going to need to deal with that kind of variation in where we get the energy from at the time. That's why, as David has pointed out, the importance of battery storage will mean that those things will happen. But what's important about the things we're talking about is not only coming right into the home, it's coming to the community. If you want to be able to make this work, you're going to have to generate your electricity closer to where it is used. You're going to need to make sure that that flexibility is as local as possible, and that will increase the efficiency of what we're talking about. It has been extraordinary what we've managed to do in terms of our offshore wind industry over the last 10 years, partly because of significant signals to the market like support like contracts for difference. What is going to be the equivalent of contracts for difference for local, integrated, clean energy projects which will transform the places in which we live? That's not just our home in a very individual way, but the communities that we live in, because that is where you will be able to balance not only power, but arguably other things like heat, because it's heat and transport that happen in places. And when you get into decarbonising the sectors, power is, we've done comparatively well. We've got a lot further to go, as your statistics indicate. But if we go to the next stage, it's going to be heat and power. They are tricky because they happen with people. And unless we design things for people, and that's not just on an individual consumer level, but also as a community, we won't manage to accelerate in the way that David has pointed out we need to.
You said that the future involves generating the power closer to where it's being consumed. That was the system in Britain in the late 19th century up until the 1920s. And it was incredibly inefficient and incredibly expensive.
Yeah, well, it was a different set of technologies then. I mean, we have to be honest with ourselves.
That's not a full answer, is it?
No, it's not a full answer, but it's a start of one, thanks.
Is it?
Yes, it is.
Explain how.
Because the point is, we had an extraordinary vision with the introduction of the national grid, and we need to have the same kind of vision about what we're going to be able to do next, because we cannot rely on that kind of centralised system for our electricity in the future. We need to be identifying what the resources are in particular places and making sure that we're maximising that. For example, Stoke has done an extraordinary amount of work on using their waste heat left over from their ceramic industry. That means that they've now got a district heating system which heats the whole of their town centre. That is partly owned by the local authority. They therefore have income. That is something which local authorities haven't thought about for a very long time. Our network includes 94 local authorities who are committing to climate action in time for in line with the science. And those kind of innovations mean that we will be thinking about the resources in our communities, and then before we start thinking, oh, don't worry, we can literally offshore it to the wind industry, because yes, that will be crucial, but it won't be the only way we'll be able to power our homes and our communities.
Tim Lord, what do you say to that?
I think that's right. I think in some ways the transition that we've made so far, which, as you say, has been enormously impressive in terms of what we've achieved, and I think we don't necessarily kind of celebrate or focus on that achievement enough in terms of leading the G7, leading the G20 in the way that we've decarbonised. The next phase is going to be more challenging. A lot of what we've done so far has been about getting energy infrastructure providers to build large centralised energy infrastructure. The next stage of the challenge involves consumers, businesses and so on in a very different way. But I do agree very much with what Polly said, that the range of technologies is shifting, and that sometimes we present this as a kind of binary set of questions. Is it offshore wind or is it gas, for example? Is it centralised generation? Is it distributed generation? Actually, local solutions will work in a lot of cases. The activeness of the demand side will make a big difference in terms of the smart systems and so on that National Grid and others are leading. And I think what we need to get away from is that kind of binary technology versus technology approach, and one which actually integrates different solutions in different parts of the country.
But what does a generating system look like that is heading towards net zero? Is there still gas generation?
I don't think there's a single pathway to net zero, but I think there are, and from the excellent work that the Committee on Climate Change did in their recent report, I think that they've sketched out some of this. You're going to need a lot of low carbon generation on that system, of course, a lot of renewables and offshore wind, nuclear, carbon capture, usage and storage becomes absolutely critical, I think, in a net zero context. You could sort of see how you could get to 80% without it. I think it's extremely difficult to see how you get to net zero without it. I think you're going to need a much more responsive energy system, a much smarter energy system. That's a kind of no-lose, and certainly something that we'd require.
But let me try to pin you down here and start by re-asking my question. Are we going to build more gas stations or not?
At the moment, we're building more gas stations. Gas has an incredibly important role as a transitional fuel.
Well, it's clearly important if it's 61% of the electricity this morning. What I'm asking you is, are we going to continue to build more or not? And is that consistent with aiming for net zero emissions?
So I think continued gas is absolutely consistent with net zero emissions, because it's got a really important role to play over the coming decades, and then potentially it's got a role to play in the longer term in combination with carbon capture and storage, absolutely.
But how can you get to net zero if gas is still a major part of our electricity generation?
I think it's hard to see a world where unabated gas provides the level of generation it's providing now in a net zero context. What I'm saying is there is a really important role over the coming decades as we transition to a lower energy system, and that with carbon capture and storage, gas potentially has a role to play in the long term as well.
And you make more of renewables by increasing the amount of battery storage, because that's where we'll have to shift, so that you make the flexibility, which is so important, and that's one of the reasons why we've relied on fossil fuel for so long, because you can switch it on and off. What you'll need to do is to be able to store more so that you can maintain that flexibility and develop the smart grids that Tim's talked about.
All right, but David, do we have the battery technology to store vast amounts of power?
So, there's a lot of points being made across the panel, and I agree with a lot of the points, but I just wanted to try and round out a couple as well as answering your question. So, specifically your question, Andrew, if the cost of battery technology is coming down drastically, and there's a number of different advancements in battery technology about, the rate of charge, the energy density, the power output divided by the weight of the battery. And so it's not only about cost that's going on in the development of battery technology. So batteries are a really, really interesting technology that in all of David's scenarios come forward as very important. I absolutely agree with Polly's points as well about the need for local community and whole system solutions involving heat and waste, electric vehicle charging, as well as how we source our individual power. But, if you were to take a standard UK domestic home, to have enough power generated from solar power for that home, you would need to put solar panels not only on the roof of your house, but 4 of your neighbours. And you'd need to have the Tesla 10 kilowatt hour power walls. You'd need to have about 170 of them to get you through an average winter. And then you'd have no resilience or redundancy associated with it. So the scale of what you would need in some of these scenarios are quite large. Now, that will move and that will change. In 5 years' time, battery technology will have moved on from where it is today. In David's scenarios for net zero, we see a doubling of the electricity demand across the UK. We go from 8 gigawatts of offshore wind connected to over 70 gigawatts. So, the size and the scale of the energy shifts that are really needed to get to net zero need to embrace all of these different technology solutions. And I absolutely agree with the speaker's last point that, we don't need to be making arbitrary technology choices and having one element competing against another. If we truly believe, as we do, that we need to get to net zero and get ourselves on a pathway, I think we need to focus on what are the decisions we need to be taking today. Where do we need to be accelerating those technologies which are cost effective and are providing the solutions for tomorrow? The key transformation that needs accelerating, in my view, now is the decarbonisation of transport. That is on the cusp of hitting us mainstream. And we need to make sure that we've got the charging infrastructure that we need. Because
that will result in a huge increase in demand for electricity.
It will result in an increase in demand for electricity. It will be staggered, though, because, the rate of new vehicle ownership in the UK is about 2.5 million a year. And there's 36 million cars in the UK today. So in any scenario, it's going to take 10, 15 years to go from pretty much where I think it's a couple of percent still today in the UK number of electric vehicles to where it needs to get to. So, and over that kind of timescale, we have got the time to build out those low carbon generation sources in order to be able to meet that electricity demand.
Polly, what do you say to David's remarks about battery power?
I basically agree with him. I mean, the idea that you would only be depending on solar, it's a good example of what the implications are of the kind of a generation you need. But we're talking about a mix, and that's what's important. Can I shift it also to the question here of the politics of this, because if we want to do this stuff fast, which is what is probably required, then we're going to need to start escalating our ambition. And there's an opportunity here for the leadership contenders in the Tory party to commit to net zero now. Whoever wins that leadership should make that their first piece of legislation, because we know that this is actually something which sends a very strong message to people who are concerned about climate change, that things need to happen. And then we need to get down into the really, really difficult, tricky stuff about making sure that people understand what this means for their lifestyles. And we need to focus, and this is why it's important to build on that in terms of transport. This needs to be about the co-benefits. I know that since the climate strikes and the Extinction Rebellion and so forth demonstrations, that the awareness and anxiety about climate change has increased. But broadly speaking, standardly, about 18% of people say they'll vote on environmental issues, and roughly about half of them are lying. We can't build a majority story about this through only focusing on the people who are deeply anxious about it. It has to become a mainstream thing. So what does that mean for my hob, my fridge, my kettle? Those kind of things, which are deeply individualistic, as well as what does that mean for how I get to school, to work, what kind of work do I do, what kind of subjects do my kids study at school. Those are the things that give us an opportunity to have a grand sense of national mission. We will only do that if we manage to establish a consensus about this. And I think that's an opportunity that at the moment, when this is a country that is deeply divided, if there's one thing that really requires the kind of things that everybody says Britain is good at, international leadership, technological innovation, those kind of things everybody should be able to agree on at a time of division, and that is something that whoever is in power should be able to start to establish and make sure that it isn't just something that happens at a national level, but also you really harness the ambition that there is at local level to make this happen. Because if you don't do that, then it will be top down, people will resist, and you'll end up again with I don't want this to happen. And that will be very damaging for not only achieving this in line with the science, but potentially politically as well.
Well said.
But the Tory, but what does it mean? Because the Tory candidates can say all they want about zero emissions, but you cannot go to the people until you have the policy implications of what net zero emissions will be. And that's what I'm trying to establish this morning. So let me go back to David Joffe here and ask you, for example, in getting to net zero emissions, does nuclear power still have a role?
It potentially does, yes.
Potentially does. That's a politician's answer.
Well,
does it or doesn't it?
well, the thing about the electricity system is we have options. So Tim will give the answer on what the current government thinks. In our modelling, we do have nuclear in there.
How much nuclear?
Well, in our scenario that we presented, but it's only indicative, we have around 10 gigawatts in 2050, but we've said that could be up to 25 gigawatts by 2050,
and that,
depending on choices that are
that
made.
would involve building more nuclear stations?
Yes, on existing sites. So the Energy Technology Institute has already identified the existing sites where we generate
But that's
nuclear
been
power.
policy for a while. Is it
Yes.
really saleable after the agreement that Hinkley Point would have guaranteed prices of twice the market rate in perpetuity, and we don't even know if it's going to be built on time or on cost, because every other one EDF has done recently, from Helsinki to Flanville in northern France, has been anything but on time or on cost. Indeed, it makes this new central line in London look a beacon of infrastructure spending there. Helsinki was meant to open, I think, in 2009. That's a decade. Do you think that's conceivable? Is that a policy that you can sell, that politicians are going to stand up and defend?
I think that's hugely challenging with that reactor design. So I think the question is, well, how do we get nuclear to a cost where it can actually contribute to a sensible, low-cost generation mix? And that might be different reactor designs. It might be moving away from the current one.
Tim Lord, the government presided over the new build of nuclear power for quite some time. It's very expensive. I've seen some studies suggesting it is the most expensive power station in the history of the world. You got the stomach to do another one like that?
So I think we are supportive of nuclear. Hinkley is expensive. It's also going to provide 7% of our electricity demand. It's a very, very large project. As you say, it's the first one in a generation, and there's a real challenge in terms of getting that supply chain up and running again. As I said before, and I think David's right, this isn't about saying it's going to be X gigawatts of one technology in 2050 and Y gigawatts of another. We need to be able to make sure we're adapting to what's happening to those technologies over time. And I think it's very clear that for nuclear and for all technologies, delivering cost reduction, demonstrating ability to deliver not just the first of a kind, but then project after project is going to be absolutely critical to that. But that blend of technologies is important. Nuclear has a really important role in providing baseload power in a way that renewables struggle to.
I understand the importance of that. That's not my argument. And indeed, as part of the energy mix, nuclear power has been the baseload power. But our existing fleet of nuclear stations is coming to the end of its life. This morning, it's still providing over 20% of our electricity, 5 times this morning what wind is doing, but they will have to be phased out. A number already have been. And I'm just trying to get, before I come on to the issue of consumers and then go to the audience, I'm just trying to get a picture, to help the audience get a picture of what will a generation supply system look like as we head to net zero emissions.
So it will have a lot of low carbon generation on the system, both renewables. I would anticipate nuclear carbon capture and storage. I think it will have to be hugely more flexible, and that includes battery storage. It includes a much more responsive demand side in particular. And I suspect that centralised generation will continue to play a really important role. I think David's talked about the number of solar panels and power walls you'd need if you did a sort of fully decentralised system. But it'll be a combination, and I think an increasing combination of centralised and distributed production.
It's quite general. Let me come to David, because the grid, as our main distributor of power, must have given a lot of thought to this, because as I understand it, the National Grid has signed up to the decarbonising of our electricity generation, the decarbonising away of our economy, which must have huge implications for your business. Tell us how you see the future.
So I think when we look at 4 different energy scenarios for the future, and the electricity system operator, which is now separate from the networks, put those out each year. And they recognise there's a range of future scenarios. There's no doubt in my mind the nuclear fleet is going to decrease as it comes to the end of its life. And EDF have done a good job, actually, of extending the life of the nuclear stations, but there's only so much you can do associated with that. But at the same time, there's been a lot of demand-responsive behaviour happening at times of winter peak, which has reduced the size of the overall electricity peaks. As we move into the electrification of transport, that's going to change, and we'll see electricity demand start to increase again in the UK. We're seeing a massive growth in the volume of interconnectors. National Grid's built 3. There's another 3 currently getting built, and a number of others getting built by other companies as well. And that's a sort of balance against that wind and solar. So, and they're not all to France. There's one to Denmark that's getting built. There's one to Norway that's getting built.
There's one to Ireland, but it never seems to send us anything.
The Irish energy market is a very small energy market.
You're very diplomatic.
Well, it's 4 gigawatts compared with, over 50 gigawatts here in the UK. So,
do we insist as we build these interconnectors that the power they're sending us is carbon-free?
So we can't, but Ireland are actually doing really, really well going there.
But they're not sending us anything.
But,
what about the others?
Norway is predominantly, is predominantly high.
This morning, the French are sending us 4.6, the Irish nothing, the Dutch 3%, the East-West interconnector. What's that one? Anyway, it's sending us nothing, so it doesn't matter. Because one of the... Say that again?
Yeah.
Oh, that's Ireland too?
Yeah.
That's why it's nothing. Right. Because one of the hypocrisies when Mrs. Merkel panicked after the Japanese nuclear disaster, and just suddenly announced the closing of all Germany's nuclear power stations, was that she imported power from Czechoslovakia, nuclear power from the Czech Republic, in other words. So I would have thought people here, to get to net emissions, would like to know that power that we are importing is subject to the same net zero target as what we're trying to build ourselves?
Well, as you know, Andrew, the Paris Accord is applying across the world, it's applying across Europe. Different countries are moving forward at different pace. The reality is, though, is if you really believe in decarbonising the UK and going after those renewable sources of generation, you need a flexible network which can cope with those times when the wind is blowing or the sun is shining, but can also cope with those times when it's not. And that's where the value of interconnectors comes, because we are an island nation. We are not on an infinite European busbar or electricity grid. And flexibility is really, really important if you're going to decarbonise the UK's electricity mix. You know, you cannot store in vast quantities yet electricity. You have to balance it second by second.
Tim and then Polly, I just want to look at the consumer, or if I could almost say the voter implications for this, because they're not often talked about. If we're to move to net zero emissions, am I right in saying we have to move by 2050 overwhelmingly to electric vehicles and electric transport, including even white van man will have to be electric? That's point one. We'll need to think, I see Mr. Ed Davey, interesting Ed Davey, as I always call him, is saying that we shouldn't be flying internally. That's obviously a clear attack on Joe Swinson, whose constituency is just outside Glasgow. But that's another potential implication. We will have to give up our gas heating system and our gas cooking system. These are all, and we may, there's a debate about this, but so far in the public mind, because of what happened to heating, to power bill, fuel bills, is that all this means bigger bills. All this is more expensive. The consumer will pay. The state may pay a bit, but the consumer is going to have to pay a lot more too. You add all that together, that's quite a hard sell.
I think it is a challenge. I mean, you wouldn't expect me to comment too much on the politics, but I think I would absolutely agree that, you know, as I said earlier, this phase of decarbonisation to date has been less about sort of real impacts on consumers. The next phase, I think, will be different. I think what you are seeing is clearly a real upswelling concern about climate change. I think people are becoming better informed about climate change. I think one of the big challenges for the next 5 to 10 years is going to be about how you translate that into consumers understanding how that is going to impact on them. I think it is worth saying, first of all, Polly mentioned co-benefits earlier. Not all of these things are bad by any stretch of the imagination. People buying electric vehicles tend to say they like them. They like the consumer experience of them, and they're doing it
but most people can't afford them.
At the moment, most people can't afford them, but the cost of batteries is coming down, and most people expect that crossover point to happen within the next few years. So it doesn't have to be a more costly outcome. It's also worth saying that, you know, one of the biggest emission savings we've had in recent years hasn't just been the power sector, it's been in boilers, where changes to boiler regulation meant that we've saved hundreds of megatons or certainly tens of megatons of carbon over recent years in a change that consumers didn't necessarily really notice, even though it was them that was delivering it. And I think government's going to need to be very intelligent in the way that it looks at that set of questions and the combination of tools that it uses to deliver it.
And it may be, too, that people should realise that with an electric vehicle, though at the moment the upsum cost is high, the running cost could be substantially lower. But Polly, how do you see, because this has barely entered our public debate. We have debates at a policy level of should we have nuclear, should we still build gas, should we continue with onshore wind, do we need to do even more offshore wind, should we do interconnect? That's fine, that happens within the square mile of here. We haven't taken this to the public yet.
Well, I think you're right. I think there is a very sort of technical conversation for those of us who are very, very interested in energy. However, when you talk about climate change, for example, I did a run of interviews on local radio around the time of David Attenborough's fantastic documentary, and almost every last question on the whole round was, well, if people are really anxious about this, what should they do? And, you know, it was live radio. I wasn't going to swear, but it shouldn't be the fact that we are talking about internalising and individualising this. There is well, I can say to people, eat less meat, fly less, get on with it. But mostly it's about putting pressure on the politicians to make some of these big decisions so that you can get those things done. Because Tim's right about the boilers. What's very interesting is I'm not sure that people are massively wedded to their boilers. I don't think they're going to march for heat pumps, but I think managing to get from, oh no, I must hold on to my boiler, I don't think people feel like that. I think they want to make sure that their home is affordable for themselves and for the planet, and that they feel warm. And we know that those kind of things make sure that we can get that shift over. Now, it's still expensive, and that's where we've got to make some big decisions. And that's where central and local government come in about sending some strong signals to the market. Yes, you may need to subsidise things. It's interesting you say that about the EVs, that it's cheaper to run. Well, it is for the time being while they're VED exempt. At some point, if there's enough of an uptake, HMT is going to start saying that's going to have to change. And also, where is the EV infrastructure charging in order for people to feel more confident about that?
You mean that there's no... that whereas an internal combustion car has a fuel duty on it,
Yeah.
there's no, well, there's a 5% VAT on electricity.
Yes, there is, but you still don't have road tax if you're an EV.
Right.
So
but that's partly a subsidy to get us to...
Well, exactly,
to do more,
but that's what I'm saying. If that goes, because HMT suddenly realises that they're losing that income, then they're going to shift over. So I think we need to, if you're talking about big, strong signals, do stuff which show that only government can do or only government can facilitate. It doesn't matter whether it's government. Well, EV infrastructure, that's going to have a big implication for the national grid because of the demand on it. But unless you feel that you're going to be able to plug in while you go to the shops, or that you can leave it somewhere overnight and it's going to be there in the morning and it's going to be able to be charged, then people are not going to feel confident about it. Can I also point out that in the CCC's report on this, they were very keen on EVs for individual use, but there wasn't an emphasis on public transport, and it was in healthy active lifestyles, walking and cycling. Fine, but that, dare I say it, is a bit of a zone 1 approach, right? If anybody's been outside, even beyond zone 2, zone 3 in London, let alone trying to get in and out of Derby or Sheffield on a standard commuter run, we're going to have to put much more investment in public transport. And that, let me say again, if you're talking about a strategic co-benefit, you're talking about rebalancing the UK economy. If there's one thing that ended up with us in the kind of pickle we are politically, it's the lack of balance in the UK economy. And strong investment in public transport infrastructure beyond London is really important if you want to make sure...
The electrification of public transport.
Partly the electrification, partly more of it. Partly more of it. And also, just have some witty and savvy ways of making sure that people will use what they've got. In Liverpool, they've made sure that all students get reduced bus fares, but also they put free Wi-Fi on it. That's a really, really simple way of making sure that kids won't ask to be able to go in the car if they can actually start using the buses. If you want to be able to shift people's behaviours, you need to make sure that it's not just about virtue, but it actually is value for money.
We have free Wi-Fi here, so tweet as much as you want about what you're hearing, and let me go to the audience and get some questions. We have a microphone there, and we have another one there, and we have one there. We have a plethora of microphones. The gentleman in the white shirt there. And keep a hand up, and I get another mic, and the gentleman in the blue shirt there. Keep your hand up. And the lady down here, nope, we've got, if you could bring the microphone to the woman there. Yes, sir.
Thanks very much. Peter Smith from National Energy Action, a fuel poverty charity. I want to pick up the question about affordability, particularly for the poorest households. The Treasury currently makes a large fortune out of carbon taxes. Can the Treasury maintain its current approach of essentially paying for all of the energy transition through consumer bills, energy consumer bills, and how urgent a priority is the need to invest in an ambitious energy efficiency programme to reduce the cost for the poorest households?
Who would you like to answer that question? Tim.
So I think that question of affordability is an absolutely critical one. I think the CCC report's really interesting on this, because what it shows is that net zero, broadly speaking, can be achieved at the same cost as we thought the 80% target could be achieved when we set it back in 2008. But clearly, within that, A, we've got to decide how to distribute those costs, and B, that if we don't do anything about that, there will be significant winners and losers. And obviously, the CCC recommended, precisely to your point, that the Treasury carry out a review of how we do that. We'll obviously set out our position on the net zero report in due course. But I think that's certainly something that we'd want to look at hard, because I think you're right that the overall approach around consumer bills, the importance of protecting the fuel poor and those least able to pay in particular is critical.
But we know that. Well, the question is, what are you going to do about it?
So they should change the Ofgem rules.
Sorry, Paul, you say that?
They should change the Ofgem rules. I mean, one of the things is that at the moment, the Ofgem is doing this equity only about current consumers rather than long term. The costs are going to go up exponentially if we only worry about what happens now. And that therefore builds in a disadvantage of being able to make the shift in a fair way, because they're only talking about equity now. I mean, in terms of the energy efficiency, we know that the energy efficiency is the easiest way of being able to decarbonise, but the incentive to do so is low. They should be devolving the eco to local authorities so that they can do stuff within their own social housing, create a supply chain, so it means that the able to pay can get on with doing what needs to be done, because it will have been proved. There are a couple of things that wouldn't take much for in order to be able to indicate that net zero is serious about being both about equity now and equity in the future.
Well, let me come back to Tim. We know that for those on lower incomes, fuel bills are a real worry. Mm-hmm. And they take, like, food and fuel are the two things you don't have a choice about. You've got to put food on the table, and you've got to heat your house in winter, and you have to cook. Mm-hmm. And they take a big percentage of lower income expenditure than they do of affluent people, most of whom people like in this hall. So one way that you could change that, or to help, and I think it goes to the question that you're asking, is to have a massive insulation program of these homes, which would A, create lots of jobs, B, cut CO2 emissions, I assume, because we're producing less electricity, and have, I would have thought, quite a dramatic effect on the fuel bills of the poor. Is that right? What bit of that don't you get?
I get all of it.
So why aren't you doing it?
So we are doing...
By you,
Yeah.
you are the government this morning, as far as...
That is a bit mean on Tim. So
I know that, but I've got nobody else.
No. It's my pleasure to...
So, but what's that? Because that would
I,
seem to be win, win, win.
So I think that is absolutely a really important point. We are doing a lot on this already. We have, Polly mentioned eco. We have reorientated eco to purely focus on the fuel poor and on innovation to try and bring forward some of the innovative techniques.
So how many houses are we improving the insulation for a year?
So I'd have to check that number, but we're investing 640 million a year through eco.
So not a lot.
640 million is a reasonably large amount, and that builds on investment over the last sort of 10 years.
The Chancellor loses that as a rounding error every day in the Treasury.
I'd have to defer to the Chancellor on that, but we are investing
Good luck with that.
doing the fuel poor.
Yes, sir, in the blue shirt.
Yeah, so it's obviously essential that it's actually the world that cuts CO2 emissions. We won't achieve any benefit from climate change with that. And the panel have mentioned quite a lot about the role for UK leadership in helping to do that. But the rest of the world can't, as a whole, import electricity from overseas. The rest of the world can't, as a whole, offshore their industrial emissions. So what can the UK do that will most encourage the rest of the world to cut CO2 emissions so we actually do avoid dangerous climate change?
David Joffe.
There's a few things that we can do. One is to demonstrate leadership by setting a net zero target and taking the policy actions that really demonstrate that we're serious about meeting it. That leadership can then transfer into the EU context where they're considering a net zero target and have further influence. In terms of actions that we can take in the UK, you will agree with this, John, carbon capture and storage is a big thing that we can take action on to actually say, well, it's not just about the low-hanging fruit, it's not just about the electricity generation and the low-cost renewables and the electric vehicles that we know are going to be cheap. It's actually how do we get to net zero, and that means doing the difficult things. It means getting rid of those.
But haven't we just cut the investment in carbon capture and storage?
We have twice. And I mean,
so explain to me how that is filed under leadership?
Well, the
unless you're going backwards.
So the UK now has a plan to demonstrate carbon capture and storage by the mid-2020s.
I don't know what that means. The UK has a
Well,
plan to
I
demonstrate.
I don't know yet what it means either. I'm not in the government, but I'm hoping they're serious about it. I mean, in 2008, the CCC recommended that CCS should be demonstrated urgently. You know, we're 11 years on from that, and it hasn't been yet. The net zero target makes it absolutely a necessity, and if we're serious about meeting it, we need to make progress on carbon capture and storage, and that means rolling out the infrastructure in the 2020s, not just in one place now, but probably in multiple places and multiple industrial
And you
clusters.
seriously think the EU, after the past 3 years, is going to take the blind bit of notice of what we think?
Well, the politics of this are
Not great.
France is planning to set a net zero target in July. I understand that the UK wants to beat France because that's the kind of thing that the UK wants to do.
The Macron government is now having second thoughts about that.
Well, we'll
We
see
are now
how.
in week 22 of the Gilets jaunes, and they're having second thoughts about that.
Sure. Well, we'll see how that plays out. But nevertheless, if the UK does it and then France does it, that then sends a strong signal to the rest of the EU. If the EU then commits to a net zero target, which the Commission has proposed, then there's momentum in this, and that can have impact more widely in the world.
I'd like to make another point as well, which is the point about pollution. So, yes, there is a worldwide leadership that, other developed countries can see what we're doing around the world. But there's also that, clean growth, creating jobs here in the UK, depolluting our UK cities, and I'm not just talking about London, I am talking about those great northern cities we've got, and levelising, if you will, and bringing that fairness, if you will, back across UK society. So I think there's a huge bunch of reasons why we should be doing this, as well as showing that leadership to the broader world, which is where the questioner was aiming.
Let me go to the woman here in the second row.
Thanks. Clem Calton from Octopus Energy. In the interest of moving away from sort of listicles of different generation technologies, how does the panel think that we can create a market framework of time of use and location of use price signals that allow...
So can you speak up a little bit? It's quite hard.
How do we create a market framework of time of use and location of use price signals that can incentivize to kind of technology agnostic approach for green electrons moving short distances over uncongested wires? And in particular, how can we ensure that households are able to both contribute to and benefit from that market framework?
Who would like to answer that?
That's for David and Tim, please.
Is that for David?
Okay, well, let me start. I'd like to congratulate you for the simplicity that you've shown on your own electricity bills, which shows the tariff difference overnight compared with day, as well as what an individual customer
Which
is.
electricity bills are these, David?
This is Octopus Energy's own electricity bill.
Right.
It is the clearest indication of what is actually going on that I've seen, and it's great to see that leadership from Octopus. So genuinely, thank you for that. I think smart meters is a really interesting topic, which comes to a couple of things that the panel have already spoken about this morning, because smart meters give the UK the opportunity to really understand the cost of electricity generation in each half-hour period of the day. But we've not engaged with the public. We've not explained that. The vast majority of the average public has a single tariff that runs the same all the way through the day. And this comes to the point of needing to engage with the UK consumers about what actually goes on in the marketplace and why smart meters, for example, are part of the answer moving forward. You also, so I think there's a need for an industry-wide debate and that knowledge base, if you will, and then I think that'll start to see the changes going on the time of use. On the geographic use, I think it comes back to a political, actually, a position. If you were talking to a Scottish nationalist MP, you would hear a lot of annoyance, actually, that the cost of electricity is greater in Scotland than it is, say, in the southwest. And that's because it costs money to transport the electrons from where they're generated to where they're consumed. So Ofgem has, in my view, correctly factored that into the bill, if you will, so that the cost is incurred most by where it's used, and the right incentives are on the industry as a whole. That's a political and a fairness issue as well, though.
But also in Scotland, there are community energy projects that are really struggling to get any way forward because they're not able to benefit from that more. They're not able to say to their next door neighbour, we'll sell it to you cheaper because it's so expensive to get it from the transmission grid.
Yeah.
There's no way of local energy projects being able to
Export.
export to their local community and put clean renewable energy onto the grid.
So the cost of building those large interconnectors from remote areas into the main grid has a cost. And when Ofgem look at that individual cost, what they're saying is there isn't a cost-benefit equation that makes sense, if you will, overall to put that connection in. So it comes back to what you're trying to optimise, which comes back to the political question, I think. So the cheapest economic solution, if that's what you're trying to optimise, means that interconnector or that circuit to the remote island in Scotland doesn't get built. If you're going for complete levelised and everybody having access to be able to do what they want to in their individual community, then you levelise the cost of connecting regardless of where you are geography. So it comes back to a political question.
It's a political decision that the government needs to send a message to Ofgem that issue about equity of not just now but in the future needs to change, because unless you do that, you're going to end up with local decentralised energy projects at a disadvantage, and we won't make the shift we need.
Let me get a few more questions before we end. There's quite a lot of hands. The gentleman in the dark sweater up at the back. Up there. Up the back. Yeah. And gentleman in the white shirt in the row there. No, over there, up there. Up there. That's it. Yes, sir.
Chandler Fernando, Innovation Centre at De Montfort University. What is the role of tax, both the split between the consumer and the producer? Because it seems to me from everything that has been said today, there will be vast capital investment required, whether it's subsidised by the government or not. And at some point, you either have to tell business, well, here is your subsidy and some to keep the price down. And for the consumer, whether we like it or not, we are going to find, based on what you've said, a significant increase in the cost or the selection and cost of energy that we choose to use.
Okay. Tim Lord?
So I don't think we can answer that question on a sort of 2050 timeline. I think what I would absolutely agree with is that we need to look at the balance between consumer bills, between taxation, between other financial incentives, and look at where those costs are born. That's going to be a challenge here in the UK. It's also going to be a challenge globally when we look at things like industrial competitiveness. There's a lot of people talking about carbon border taxation, those kind of things. Those are all the kinds of things we're going to have to look at because there is an issue, as I said earlier, about the way that we balance these costs across the economy to make sure they're manageable.
If I can add, by 2050, we expect some of these things to be cheaper than what we do today. So, for example, the renewable electricity, the electric vehicles, there will be areas where the costs are higher. But it's up to government to make that case. But there's a crucial thing.
At the moment, in the public mind, rightly or wrongly, they believe all of what we're talking about will mean more for them, because that's been their experience until now. They've seen this reflected in their electricity fuel bills. So
absolutely. So
they may be wrong about the future, but people will generally be guided by what they know so far, and they've seen their bills go up.
And we'll see that journey through the 2020s as the cost of electricity starts to come down, because some of the expensive subsidies that we were paying before come off bills. But the good news story in the 2020s is that electric vehicles will become cheaper than petrol vehicles. People will start to see the benefits, not only in terms of tackling climate change, also reduced air pollution, but also in their pocket, they will see that this is cheaper for them.
But David, we're going to have to double the capacity of the grid, maybe more than double the capacity of the grid. Can that really be done without extra cost, without consumers having to pay more?
So I think there's no question in my mind that there is a huge investment needed in our energy, our transport, infrastructure here in the UK if we're going to decarbonise the UK. I think we can look at forward cost curves and we can look at today's prices, and we can scare ourselves sometimes about the size of that future cost, because There's going to be a lot of technological innovation, and we've seen, you know, cost vectors on solar, on offshore wind, on storage absolutely change dramatically. But you're right, there is a huge investment needed, and it's a political decision as to whether that is paid for by the public purse or whether that goes on to consumer bills. We talked earlier about taxation. I think the Chancellor gets something like £26 billion worth of taxation at the moment from petrol.
Yeah, that's a fuel duty.
Yeah.
And that's even after having frozen it in real terms for about, what,
So
10 years now.
so I spoke earlier about having clear policy decisions or directional decisions associated with how some of these things are going to play out. So, you know, today, get an electric vehicle, you save a lot, you can charge it overnight. It actually, you know, if you can afford the capital cost of the upfront, you can save a lot of money. That's why London taxi drivers are welcoming the transition over to electric vehicles. But that isn't sustainable unless we can see that future direction of what that taxation policy is likely to be.
Okay.
But we shouldn't scare people about the future, but we should be honest with people.
I want to have one more question, and then we're going to have to end this panel and go straight to the next one.
Hi there. How do you get the right policy for carbon pricing post-Brexit? Because we need a new policy.
Don't all rush.
So we're consulting at the moment on what the potential future models should look like. I think carbon pricing has obviously been a massively important driver of emission reduction through the ETS and through the carbon price floor here in the UK. And you talked earlier about...
It's one reason why coal is now barely featuring.
Yeah, absolutely.
In our
and
generation.
you know, we've gone from 40% of coal only 6 years ago to zero now, so hugely impactful. I think you probably wouldn't expect me to give a very specific answer at this point, given where we are on negotiations on Brexit and so on, to what that answer looks like. But I think, you know, we're consulting on what some different models look like. We think carbon pricing is a really, really important part of the policy mix in terms of delivering emission reductions, particularly in the power sector and in the industrial sector. And I think it will continue to play that role. Exactly what that looks like post-EU exit, we'll be very interested to see the responses to the consultation, and obviously that will be part of the wider negotiation.
Andrew, can I give a very personal answer to that? You know, we factor in the true cost of carbon into all of our investment decisions. And it's started to change some of our investments that we make within National Grid. And I think it needs that signal around what the future cost of carbon is, so other businesses do similar.
David Wright, Polly Billington, Tim Lord, David Joffe, thank you for giving us an excellent start, our first panel. Round of applause for our first panel of the morning. Thank you.